Hello, everyone. Welcome to Archeo Viking. Today, I'm bringing to you a fascinating recent archaeological finding. This archaeological finding was published in November of 2021, and in it, it discussed the findings of a type of ancient armor called scale mail or scale armor. Scale armor being a type of armor where various rectangular or square or sometimes triangular plates are laid on top of each other to make a type of armor. What was interesting about this type of scale armor that was found in Western China was that it was discovered that it didn't originate in China at all. Using dendrochronology and various other types of dating, they found it originated in Mesopotamia rather than China, several thousand miles west of China. Now, the questions of how this happened will be covered in this video, specifically involving three different cultures at the time. So, what were these cultures? Well, the three main cultures that were discussed in the paper and were found to have been connected to this armor were the Neo Assyrian Empire, the Scythian steppe horsemen or horse lords of Central Asia, and the powerful yet fragmented Zhou Dynasty of China. As I said, what was interesting about this armor is it originated several thousand miles west of China and Mesopotamia, where many city-states such as Ur and Babylon and even Jericho were built. We know it is the Fertile Crescent as seen in this picture. However, by the time of the building and creation of this armor, a dominant empire existed in this region known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Neo-Assyrian Empire. And what they did is they designed armor such as this. As I said, scale armor, where you see these little interlapping squares and lines laid on top of each other to give a great degree of protection. And what was very interesting is it matched a type of armor found that is currently held in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York that was found within Scythian territory. As you can see, when you compare the two, they look very similar. And they're found to have been roughly made at the same time. However, what's also interesting is that the armor, both these armors, seem to have been for different types of military units, with the armor found in Western China being mainly used for what they can tell is infantry units, being that it was heavier and thicker, whereas the armor at the Met seems to have been used for cavalry as it is lighter and thinner, which makes sense because it was found here in what is now modern day Central Asia, where Kazakhstan and various other modern nations are. But at the time, it was right in the middle of the Scythian cultural sphere. And I'll cover the Scythians a little later. Meanwhile, the armor found in Western China was found right here around this region in Yanghai and various other places, which was slightly outside of what we think the Scythian cultural sphere was, though it could have also been in it, and was also west of the Zhou Dynasty sphere, though we know that, as I'll cover later in the video, cultural transference did happen. And also, again, it's several thousand miles away from its origin, where Mesopotamia and the Neo Assyrian Empire were. So, what does this all mean? Well, the find of this armor shows that there was a larger area of influence for both the Neo Assyrian Empire, the Chinese, and the Scythian cultures, as right around this time, shortly after this, the date that this scale mail was found in Western China, we begin to see the adoption of scale armor in Zhou Dynasty China's military, as well as in the Scythian sphere. So, therefore, this supports an earlier than previously thought west to east transfer of technology into China, as well as an east to west, because chariots were also brought into China by the Scythians and various other cultures, as well as some technologies were spread from east to west, or may have been spread east to west, as I'll cover a little later. But with that in mind, who did it? How did it get there? Well, here are the three most likely scenarios. First, there's the possibility that Assyrian mercenaries who weren't necessarily connected to the Assyrian Empire itself, but did originate into it, were present in Central Asia and Western China. In contrast, there could have also been Scythian mercenaries who went and were hired by the Assyrian Empire for one campaign or so, and then returned to their territory in Central Asia and Western China with this armor in tow. Another possible scenario is that the Median Empire, that was a rival and eventually conqueror of the Assyrian Empire, and various other Iranian kingdoms adopted Assyrian technology and brought it into Central Asia. Or it could have been all three. I mean, most certainly could have been all three at various different points throughout history. So while it's never going to be for 100% sure who or which of these three scenarios brought it there, these are the three most likely scenarios, as posited in the paper, which will be cited in the sources. So with that in mind, I think it's important that we cover these three cultures and explain why they were so important in the early Iron Age world. So the first we're going to cover is the Assyrian Empire, or the Neo Assyrian Empire. And the reason it's called the Neo Assyrian Empire is because the Assyrian Empire actually goes on for a lot longer than just the founding of the Neo Assyrian Empire in 911 BCE. The Assyrian Empire actually goes as far back as at least the 1400s BCE, and was a rival of the Hittite Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Egyptian Empire. However, unfortunately, much like many of the other civilizations of the Bronze Age, the Assyrian Empire, or the Middle Assyrian Empire as the proper term is, went into decline roughly around 1178 BCE or 1177 BCE, along with the Hittite Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Mitanni Empire, and the Mycenaean Empire, with the only survivor really being the Egyptian Empire, though the Assyrian Empire did to a point survive. And that's what allowed, a couple of centuries later, the Neo-Assyrian Empire to rise in 911 BCE, where they began to rapidly expand and conquer territories, with eventually leading them to come to conflicts with Central Asian tribes such as the Cimmerians and the Scythians in 720 BCE, that also eventually led to Sargon II of Assyria, the emperor at the time, dying in battle while driving the Cimmerians back into their territory. Though, despite the setback, the Assyrian Empire did eventually reach its height, conquering after conquests such as Egypt, Israel, and Babylon, and various other areas, including Ugarit and various kingdoms near Central Asia, but weren't quite in Central Asia. However, as many empires do, eventually the Neo Assyrian Empire was conquered and defeated roughly between 612 and 609 BCE, with the rise of the Median and Babylonian empires, who also had help from Scythian mercenaries. So, what was so important about the Neo-Assyrian Empire? Why is it considered one of the most important empires in history? Well, for one thing, it's considered the world's first true empire. While certainly the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, the Hittite Kingdom, the Mitanni, the Mycenaeans, and the Babylonians could certainly be considered empires to a certain degree, the Assyrian Empire was by far the largest that the world had ever seen at the time, encompassing the territory of all of those kingdoms rather than just minor regions such as the Egyptians or the Babylonians. And I use minor lightly because they still were vast regions. They also developed the world's first centralized empire and professional army. In other words, the army was highly trained and highly professional, and they had specific units set aside for specific reasons, and they would each be highly trained. Another thing would be that they were responsible for the spread of the Aramaic languages, such as the languages that the figure who was the likely inspiration for Jesus Christ spoke, as well as various other Semitic languages. And then also they were responsible for the forced resettlement of conquered peoples throughout their empire. In fact, one of their favorite things to do was to take iron rings and put them into the ears of captives and put them in lines and lead them across the empire. So one, they would not try to rip their own ear out, and two, once they moved them to a new part of the empire, they would be less likely to rebel against the Assyrian Empire, because one, they were moved to a different region that they had no idea where they were, and two, they had been beaten into submission in the process, and they could never, for the most part, return home. This is the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its height. And as you can see, it's quite large, containing what was once the Egyptian Middle Kingdom's height, the Hittite Empire's height, though part of the Hittite Empire was here as well, the Babylonian Empire, as well as their original Assyrian Empire, and the various other smaller kingdoms such as Ugarit. So, and then also here's an interesting look at their military system. So you can see really just how organized and fearsome this empire was. For one thing, you can see the aforementioned scale mail right around here, as well as in this picture. But also you can see that they had technological innovations such as siege engines. You can see this battering ram right here going up to a wall that of a city that they're besieging and just tearing into the wall. So very powerful, very professional army. And then here's another example of the forced relocation of captives of conquered peoples to other parts of the empire. A good example of this is mentioned in the Bible, as well as archaeology, where the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and then they promptly lifted up all the Jews and other ethnic groups that lived in the kingdom of Judah and marched them to Assyria and other places, which is probably, along with the Babylonian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel, the real reason that the lost tribes of Israel disappeared. It wasn't, they went to America or anything, or any other ridiculousness that the Mormons and other white supremacists try to preach. They were probably just relocated into these empires and, intermarried and disappeared. So the next group I want to discuss is the Scythians. The Scythians were a Central Asian nomadic group uh, that originated in Western Mongolia and Eastern Kazakhstan that were most likely based off of archaeological and genetic evidence, descended from a branch of the Indo-Europeans called the Andronovo. The Andronovo being themselves a branch of the Santashta culture of Indo-Europeans. In essence, the first Indo-European cultures to migrate out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the homeland of the Indo-Europeans, or the Yamnaya and the Afanasyevo, who with the Afanasyevo going to Mongolia and the Yamnaya going west into Europe. The Afanasyevo eventually declined and intermarried within various other Mongolian groups. However, the Andronovo, the ancestors of the Scythians, broke off from these groups and the Santashta between 2000 and 1400 BCE and moved into Western Mongolia and Kazakhstan, and further intermarried with the original ethnic groups as well as the remnants of the Afanasyevo culture, therefore creating the Scythians. The Scythians then did not arrive into the original, migrate into the original homeland of the Pontic-Caspian steppe until roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, where they would eventually begin raids into the Neo Assyrian Empire. And then also later on, under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, they began raiding the Persians as well and Greek city-states as well, actually killing Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, in the 530s, and also repelling invasions by his son Darius the Great, as well as in 331 BC repelling raids by the Greek armies of Alexander the Great, and performing successful raids into Greece. And this would lead to the height of the Scythian cultures from 496 BCE to 310 BCE. Unfortunately, the Scythians would eventually be absorbed by the Sarmatians and the Slavs, as well as the eventual arrival of the Alans and the Huns. Though the Alans were also considered sort of relatives of the Sarmatians, so one could argue that it was simply the Sarmatians, Slavs, and Huns, though the Alans do seem to have been at least called something different than the Sarmatians. So what were the accomplishments and characteristics of these Scythians, of these horse lords? For one thing, they created complex, beautiful art out of gold that we have thousands of examples of. They defeated the Greeks, Persians, and Assyrians on multiple fronts, and controlled vast swaths of Asia. Another thing is they were a nomadic horse-based culture, and were considered the best cavalry at the time, largely in thanks to the development of the composite recurve bow that has since been made famous by the Huns in the Mongol Empire. This is their territory, and this is why I say vast swaths of Asia, because you can see they go over here all the way to into the Balkans, Romania and Greece and such, all the way over here into Central Asia and parts of China and Mongolia, which are considered generally parts of East Asia. And then they have the art, this beautiful animalistic art of reindeers and heroes, and then chimeric-like animals that look sort of like a mix between various other animals, such as birds of prey and such. Uh, and then you have their types of weapons. That, as I described, you have the composite bow that allowed them to be easily carried on the horse so that they can fire while riding horses going at full speed. And also, these bows could be made to fire at very, very high poundages so that they could pierce lots of types of armor, even scale mail. And then they are also known for the Scythian axe, an axe that you see in the left picture that was sort of like what we would think of an American Indian tomahawk, though not quite. I don't want you to anyone watching this to assume that they're the same, but it still gives a general idea of the size and how it was used. And they use these weapons to great effect. In fact, there's an Assyrian king at one point who was afraid of the Scythians. He threatened the Scythian king, and the Scythian king was like, well, do you want me to invade? Because I can easily invade and we'll make you see, you'll see who's really, more terrifying, essentially. And the Assyrian king promptly withdrew his threats. They are also known for the types of arrows, and known for being spectacular archers, as I mentioned with the horse archery, not just on the horse, just in general. And you can see sort of the types of arrows that they would have. These sort of trilobite, small triangular type arrows were the types of arrows that they would use to pierce armor. And then you can also see into the left, they would incorporate the idea of being skilled archers into their art, which again is very beautifully and artfully and masterfully carved and smelted and such into these shapes. All right, the last culture I want to cover, who's involved with this artifact, are the Zhou Dynasty of China. So the Zhou Dynasty is the third sort of traditional dynasty that we associate with China. It's arguable that Chinese civilization actually goes back further than the oldest, the Zhou Dynasty. But we begin to see these dynastic factions arise around 5,000, 4,000-ish years ago, with the Zhou Dynasty rising around 1045 BCE after overthrowing the Shang Dynasty and establishing control over a large amount of China, though it should be noted that this was a largely feudalistic kingdom. And this feudalism is sort of the reason that the Western Zhou Dynasty, or Zhou Dynasty, declined, because they were often faced multiple civil wars, but also they faced constant raids by nomadic tribes such as the Scythians and another nomadic group called the Zhirong, or the Rong tribes. Fortunately, however, despite the Western Zhou Dynasty declining in 771 BCE, all it did was move east to a different capital and establishing the Eastern Zhou Dynasty. Though the rulers had decreased authority and witnessed increased warfare between these the rival vassal kingdoms that originally made up the feudalistic society of the Zhou Dynasty. And these wars were massively fought. It is also during this time that we begin to see a shift in military technology in China from the more chariot-driven Bronze Age warfare that made up the Jia and Shang dynasty to a sort of Assyrian-style professional army in the 400s and 300s. I want to make clear that I'm not saying the Chinese adopted this professional style army from the Assyrian Empire, despite the cultural trade between them. I think this is just an independent development. though I do agree that the scale mill was probably, along with the chariot, was probably introduced into China from outside. We do have evidence such as Sun Tzu and various other military stratagems that were developed around the time called the hundred philosophies that show that the development of professional armies in the Zhou Dynasty was solely a Chinese affair. And one great example of this is the Kingdom of Qin, which was one of the two largest kingdoms, along with the Chu Kingdom. So the Kingdom of Qin really began to shine in 316 BCE when King Huihuen of Qin conquered the southern kingdoms of Shu and Ba in southern, what is that now, modern day southern China, with the Ba Kingdom being well known for its fierce warriors who were known as the White Tiger Warriors because they worshipped a white tiger god and wore white tiger pelts along with their armor and had the white tiger as their national symbol. So they were known for being as fierce as the tiger, and were also used as mercenaries because of this by the Qin after they conquered Shu and Ba in what is now southern China, as I said, or modern day Sichuan China. After this, Hu Huin went on to defeat and conquer the last of the Zhirong nomadic tribes. Ironically, and most definitely not intentionally, at the time that this king of Qin was expanding west and south to increase his realm, Alexander the Great was entering into India, where he faced his maybe victory against the Indian king Porus, though there is some debate about whether or not he did win, since the only accounts we have are from him and he or from Alexander the Great, and he stated that King Porus was able to keep his authority and roll over his kingdom, which is something he had not done previously. But that's a whole different video. But either way, it is the rise of Qin is contemporary with the rise of the Macedonian Empire. And unfortunately, the Qin dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, was conquered by the Qin kingdom in 256 BCE, with the last Zhou stronghold being conquered and the king being deposed. And then, of course, after that happened one of the most famous events in all of Chinese history. The Qin king at the time, who named himself Qin Shi Huang, conquered all of China and declared himself the first emperor of China. Therefore, while not technically, he officially ended the Zhou dynasty, with the technical end of the Zhou dynasty being the conquest of the Zhou stronghold in 256 BCE. So what are the accomplishments and characteristics of this Zhou dynasty? Well, first, they're the ones who originated the 2,000-year-old concept of the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven is this idea that ruled Chinese politics for over 3,000 years. For over 3,000 years, where the idea is an emperor in a dynasty only controls China so long as they are seen as virtuous in the eyes of heaven and in the eyes of the gods. And if they start becoming misbehaving and they start doing things that the gods view as immoral, then they will pass on the mandate to another ruler, which was their essentially justification for their overthrow of the Shang dynasty. Another thing is they completed, much like the Scythians, they created very complex art. And then, of course, this is the time period that saw the rise of the 100 schools or the 100 philosophies. such as the three most well-known of the time, other than Buddhism, which would come later, were Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism. And then also they developed, as I said, large centralized organized armies, sometimes ranging in the 500,000 range, other times in the million person range. And there's, of course, always some exaggeration that has to be taken into account, but it's very clear that these kingdoms could field very large, very highly trained armies. Another thing is the kingdom developed hydraulic engineering and advanced agricultural practices in the Chinese basin, something that had been a little bit developed in the two previous dynasties, the Jia and Shang dynasties, but this is where we begin to really see these technological advancements in East Asia. And then, of course, the Zhou Dynasty was where the crossbow was invented. That's right. The crossbow was a Chinese invention. The best we can guess based off of archaeological evidence is that the crossbow was invented in the 700s BCE, with our earliest accounts being mentioned roughly 500 BCE and 400 BCE. Now, this is where I was earlier in the beginning of the video was talking about. Now, there's a possibility that the technological transference wasn't just west to east, but east to west. And I am personally of the thought that this is certainly one of the more likely scenarios, because crossbows were invented in Greece 200 years later, in 500 BCE. So seeing that the armor transferring over 3,000 or more miles east into Western China, it's certainly possible that the crossbow transferred from China several thousand miles west into Greece. Now, of course, I could be wrong, and I'm fully willing to admit that this may also just as likely be a case of independent development. I'm not, trying to say that Greece developed because of China or vice versa. I just think that the idea of the crossbow transferring west now needs to be revisited after we have found Assyrian and Mesopotamian armor in Western China. So, and this is the general size of the Zhou Dynasty. And what's interesting to me is if you look at this and you look at the comparison of the Assyrian Empire, they're fairly close in size. And you're free to rewind the video or look at these pictures and compare. I do think the Assyrian Empire was slightly larger, but it's still interesting to note how close in size they were. And then you have their art, and you can see their art is very beautiful. And in many cases, such as the figure on the right, it's very similar to the Scythian art that we saw. In fact, it's been proposed that these are adopting nomadic Central Asian styles, which again goes back to the east-west and west-east technological exchange. This is another, for me, is another piece of evidence showing that it's certainly possible that the crossbow could have gone west. And then we have certainly Chinese styles of art, such as the iron pot and bowl to your left, as well as the sort of lion dog-esque creatures to your right on the picture. And then we have their military advancements. We have iron swords, that many of which could actually remain sharp for thousands of years, such as the famous sword of Gojun, though that is up for debate whether it was the forging techniques that left it so sharp or it was just the acidic and chemical makeup of the soil that allowed it to stay so sharp. But it certainly must not be discounted that these swords could stay sharp for thousands of years. And then we have the crossbows. The first is the one on the far right, which was the general style of crossbow and was ridiculously powerful and ridiculously hard to pull back. In fact, they would have to put the crossbow facing down and put their feet on the bow part and pull up the string. However, despite that, it was still considered easier to train somebody in this and easier to use than the specialism that was needed for the steppe composite bow. And what's very interesting about these is they could match the steppe composite bow to a great degree, as the farthest extent that these crossbows have been shown to shoot was over 600 yards. That's 6 football fields, and they would have between 1,000 and 10,000 of these crossbowmen in their ranks. So you could just imagine you don't even see the enemy yet, and there's a rain of crossbow bolts falling down upon your army. And then there is, to me, the most interesting of the crossbows developed in China, the repeating crossbow, or you could have between 8 to 10 or 12 crossbow bolts and fire them in rapid succession. Now, it should be stated that these obviously didn't have the same range or power necessarily as the larger crossbows. But what's very interesting is tests have been done in the past that shows that these crossbows had the same firing rate as a Winchester rifle. So essentially, the Chinese armies had rifles before even the founding of gunpowder, where they would have, once the army got close enough after being pelted by the more powerful, longer range crossbows, they would pelt them with over 10 or 12 crossbow bolts per 10,000 people as they were coming close. So very powerful, very advanced military. So that concludes our video. So I hope now that we have discussed this, we have a better understanding of Asian cultures in the Iron Age. We also have an understanding that they were far more connected than previously thought, as much of history is. I think it's important that we put behind us this idea that cultures were one superior to the other, or when they weren't, and two, that they were distinct cultures and homogenous and never had contact with each other. That being said, however, I should also say that we should not, despite this revelation, we should not say that one culture necessarily created the other. That's what pseudoscientists say. The whole ideas of Atlantis and stuff like that. These cultures were very much capable of creating their own technologies and their own civilizations, and did, but they also helped each other develop new technologies through exchange. And that is the nuance that needs to be understood. And that's why I shared the paper and discussed these cultures, is because that is what the archaeological evidence is showing, is that these cultures did very much develop on their own and develop their own civilizations, but they also helped each other advance and influence each other's cultures, albeit indirectly, but still influence nonetheless. Well, with that, that ends the video, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you like, share, and subscribe the video, and you have a good day.